I'm going to give you a quick recap first as to a bit of the background about the nature reserve, how it came about, where it all came from, as I know some of you might have never been there before or a little bit familiar with it, but I've never heard a bit of the detail. So I'm going to run you through that. So let's dive in. If I can just start by, first I'll give you an overview as to us as Chester Zoo and our involvement in UK conservation work. So many of you might know that the zoo's reach is global, from direct species work such as breeding and returning species into the wild, and that's everything from as small as a snail right up to a rhino. We fund partner organisations as well to deliver in situ conservation programmes. You might have also heard of our other work such as our palm oil programme, so it's quite varied, and we work with partners around the world to prevent extinctions. Within our work, the UK focus is just as important as our work across the globe, and that's often an odd one. When we say to people actually work in conservation in the UK, there's an awful lot of people that don't sort of twig that actually the UK is in quite dire needs really when it comes to biodiversity and the species we have here. What you can hopefully see here is some stats taken from the State of Nature report, which came out last year in 2019. Do recommend give it a Google and have a read of it. It doesn't make for cheery reading, I've got to be honest, but it's a bit of an eye-opener as to where biodiversity is at in the UK. As you can see there, one of those first stats, 15% of our species are threatened with extinction in the UK, and that figure is actually probably quite an underestimation, which is quite frightening, isn't it? The pressures on our biodiversity and our ecosystems is huge. I'd also recommend taking a look for more background at the Lawton Review, which is something that came out in 2010. And one of the big key messages from that report was that in the UK, we need more sites protected for nature. We need them to be bigger and better. And crucially, we need them to be joined up as well. So the data is out there. Biodiversity in the UK is largely in decline, unfortunately. So what this means for us as a conservation charity is that, yeah, the work begins at home, basically. And over the last 20 years, Chester Zoo has been directly involved in a number of UK-based projects. So you may have heard some of them. We've had our Dormouse Research Project. We've been working to propagate black poplars, so tree species as well as mammal species. And there's quite a wide range of projects currently on the go at the minute. We're still working on a large heath project in combination with Lancashire Wildlife Trust. And you've heard, if you've been on these talks before, we've mentioned Josh Styles and the North West Rare Plants Initiative, which we support. So there's an awful lot of hard work to be done. And we also quite literally work in our own backyard too. So the zoo site that we refer to is actually quite big. Our backyard is probably slightly bigger than yours, I should imagine. We've got just over 240 hectares, which we own and manage now. As you can see on that plan there, the red line, hopefully you can see it, shows our boundary. To the north, that yellow section is the Shropshire Union Canal, or the Shroppy, as some locals refer to it. The extra little square bits that you can see on there is the local wildlife site boundary. So the canal itself and some adjacent habitats there are a local wildlife site. And that was obviously the topic of last month's wildlife exchange session. So yeah, we've got the canal to the north. You can see the M53 there to the right of your screen. Our boundary sits just a little bit inside there along Worthing Road, and then to our western boundary we've got the A41, which is the main entrance to the zoo if you've ever been coming in from that direction. What you can also see on that plan, that purple section, is what we call the core area of the zoo, so the central area of the zoo, which is the sort of the main attraction. But last but not least, just at the top of that plan, that hatched area you can see is the nature reserve. So, and that's the subject of what we're going to be talking about tonight. I wanted to show you this plan so you can get an idea of the landscape scale and where we sit from that point of view. So you can see it's quite an agricultural area, but also on that urban edge. Couple of kilometres outside the city, but we've got good connectivity. It's generally quite open agricultural land around where we are. We've got lots of hedges. There's the canal, of course, which ultimately leads down to the Countess Country Park, which I know many of you know, and the Chester Wetlands Centre, which is hopefully emerging. So the nature reserve itself, let's dive into that. How did it begin? It began life as quite a, I'm going to say bland, to be honest, a bland agricultural field that was grazed by cows. So not particularly species rich, unfortunately, not like it is now. So it was an agricultural field, quite typical of most of Cheshire really, smallish field sizes, hedges around it and some trees as well. And the nature reserve came about because Sarah, who you've already heard introduced tonight, had a dream, and Sarah wanted to create a nature reserve at the zoo site. Sarah's worked for a long time at the zoo on the native species project. So the aims of the nature reserve that Sarah had were to provide a protected habitat that was joined up, that had that connectivity to the local landscape. But a really important element of it was to be able to provide training in species identification, recording for people and monitoring, and to do that through events for the community. As Chester Zoo's work is global, we also wanted to use it to provide opportunities for genuinely for people to come and study wildlife, but also to make that connection with conservation issues in the UK. So there's that comparison with the zoo's global work, but also what we do on our own doorstep. And also the big aspect of the nature reserve was not just to create somewhere for wildlife, but genuinely that people could come and visit it. So to capture those, what was sort of referred to as regular zoo visitors coming through the zoo gates, to draw them down and come and have a look at the nature reserve as well. So how did all this come to fruition? Yeah, it wasn't just a case of putting some wildflower seed down, that's for sure. So a planning application went in. And what you can see here is the actual plans that were drawn up for the nature reserve. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see phase 1, which was the start. On the right-hand side, you can see phase 2. So phase 1 now sits in that little square, which is the entrance to the nature reserve. And tree planting started on phase 1 back in early 2013. Then it opened in 2014, and phase 1 was completed and opened in 2018. Phase 2 is 4 times bigger than the first little bit, phase 1. So it's a fantastic site. So what was created was we've got the Arboretum section in phase 1, we've got some hedges, ponds, wet meadows, we've got some scrubby bund areas which offer a good little bit of habitat, we've got the amazing wildflower meadow and the wetland and the bird hide as well. And critically, all the access was put in, so what you can see there in the plans is the areas for people to sit and the paths offering that connectivity and accessibility around the site as well. This is what it looked like, and near enough in the beginning. We went from that cowgrace field basically, which was very much a species poor site, and the JCBs rolled in, which does seem a bit dramatic, but JCBs can literally work miracles on fields like that. So what was really important with the nature reserve was to strip off all that topsoil, which was so rich in nutrients. So in order to create a wildflower meadow, you need nutrient poor topsoil, subsoil, which is really the only way to get that habitat created is to strip it all off. So that JCB there is stripping off that topsoil, and we pushed it back into bunds around the edge of the site. Otherwise, it would take decades of just doing a cut and lift each year before any kind of wildflowers came in, and then you would still need those wildflowers in the area to be able to set seed in the first place. So it's a big job. So after all of that topsoil was stripped off, came the good bit. We managed to source some green hay from a site called Kippers Meadow, which is just over the border in Flintshire. That green hay was lifted with a small baler and then quickly brought to the zoo's nature reserve site. The species that were in that original meadow were things like devil's bit scabious, field scabious, pignut, bird's foot trefoil, common spotted orchids as well. So it was a really diverse, brilliant native species meadow. So the bales were brought in, spread across the site. You can see zoo staff there. We're happily spreading those green hay bales around the site so it could all set seed. Nothing else has been added, and each year now we do a cut and lift on that meadow only. Important to note is it's changing each year, which is something that Chloe's going to cover shortly for you. The plant diversity is expanding and growing, and it's really great to see that change over the last few years. So what does it look like? The whole site now is a little bit different. So we've gone from a bland green field. So just to orientate yourselves, on the bottom of the picture there, we've got the Shropshire Union Canal. And then at the top, that's the entrance, the main entrance for the zoo. So we've got phase 1 here with the Arboretum and the amphitheatre, for those of you who've been to site and know it, our main meadow, and these are the bunds that we refer to. I'm just giving you the heads up on these because Chloe's going to mention a few of these areas shortly, so it gives you a little bit of an idea of where she's talking about. This picture was taken back in 2017, and the site has changed and evolved a little bit now, but it's quite a nice aerial picture, so I wanted to put that one in. So yeah, it was created from scratch, the habitats were made, the seeds were sown. So beyond that, has it been a success? Well, the only way to find that out is to have some evidence. That means monitoring and recording, but what? So in the beginning, there was obviously lots of discussions about what kind of monitoring would take place, what's best to do, how often to do it. Monitoring is all dictated as well by what resources you've got, as with anything. So there's an awful lot of tools out there. Most of the monitoring now that we focus on follows national guidelines. So whether or not that could be the Common Bird Census, we follow butterfly conservation guidelines in terms of the butterfly transects that are done. And Chloe's going to go into more detail for you on this as well. It's really important to do the monitoring, and it's essential because we need to be able to demonstrate, as we said, if something has worked or not. And this is what brings us full circle really as Chester Zoo. Are we making a difference to biodiversity at that local and ultimately national level? As the State of Nature report states, which this is what this clip is taken from, that highlighted that data sets held by local record centres help to identify the most valuable sites for wildlife, and that data can be used to inform nature recovery network mapping. And not only that, but by combining those different data sets across species, you can look at broader patterns and that change over time, which is a really important, crucial bit in order to know how our habitats and our environments are doing. Without monitoring, we simply don't know. So we need to be able to show those trends and which species are doing well, which leads us on to this year's monitoring. So collaboration and partnership work is a really important aspect of what we do as Chester Zoo. Everything we do pretty much is in partnership with some other conservation organisations somewhere along the lines. And that's because, quite simply, preventing extinction isn't, you know, a one-man band job. It can only be done working in partnership. So for us and the Nature Reserve, that's where Record come in. Since the establishment of Record as Cheshire's local record centre, we've had a really close working relationship with the team there over the years, and they are the only organisation in Cheshire, as I said at the beginning, focusing on data collection and management of wildlife records for the county. It really helps us that they are based at Chester Zoo, but they're very much their own independent charity and organisation, and we're just really lucky to have such fantastic neighbours. Without doubt, the Record partnership is one that's been a huge benefit to us, especially with the Nature Reserve, and we've developed a really good working relationship, I'd like to think. And they've been key as well. Record have been there all along as well. Since very much the beginning of the development of the Nature Reserve, the team and the volunteers have helped everything from planting trees to coming out and delivering bio-blitzes for us. So they've been very much there all the way along, working with us side by side. And more than that, it's about community as well. That's what's really important for us as Chester Zoo, is that partnership working aspect. And so, yeah, Record were able to bring that in spades. So with that, let me pass you over to Chloe from Record to tell you all about the amazing results she's got this year, which is staggering considering that actually, yeah, she has had quite a difficult task in taking on board all the monitoring this year. It's not been easy for a number of reasons, as you can imagine. So with that, over to you, Chloe.
Yes, it has been hard this year, but I just need to say it has been really fun as well. So I don't want anybody to feel sorry for me at all, because it's been really great fun. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the reserve. I'm going to tell you more about it. And what I want to do really is to take you like on a trip, if you like, through the reserve to all those corners of it, and to find really the amazing network of life that is down there, and all those little lives that are being lived out on a really different scale to our own down on the reserve. And really take you on a trip across the season as well, and introduce you to what is going on down there. Okay, so you've already seen an aerial shot of the reserve itself, and you know that this is the entrance bit. This sort of slopes gently down to the canal, and this part here is very sort of damp, wet meadows. This isn't public access because it's too damp, and also it would disturb the wildlife. But there is a whole area as well along here where my cursor is, where actually it's mainly reed bed and scrubs, so you can't get onto there. It's too, you know, it's too full of vegetation and everything. But there is lots of wildlife on there, so I'm telling you that because I'm going to refer to it a bit later. And actually, part of the stuff I've been doing does take me on the route which goes off along the canal to the right as well, at the bottom of there. So I'm going to start off though with a day in March, and this is me and my colleague Lena, and we're down there. It's quite a cold, windy day, as you can see, and I'm sort of clutching my net a little bit hopefully. And the reason for that is because we're about to start the monitoring on the reserve for the season, and we're going to be looking at the bees and hoverflies. And you might kind of, looking at that scene, it's quite a wintry scene, think, wow, this might be a little bit early. But actually, very soon after we get onto the reserve, we find this lovely little bee. It's absolutely tiny. It's one of the very early bees that comes out early in the season. And so it's lovely to see it already there, little mining bee. Walking through the reserve, there are the mounds at the side there, which we call buns, and also this hedge, which is sort of growing out into the meadow a bit with very long grasses and lots of brambles there and things. And there's some fox poo. So we know there's fox there. We know there's something else there as well. The poo is full of fur, so it's been eating something, probably rabbits, but maybe something smaller as well. And certainly what we see next confirms that there probably are small mammals. And that is because there's a connection between small mammals and bumblebees. And what we see is queen bumblebees sort of lazily zigzagging over the grass, like you might have seen early in spring. And every now and then they just drop down, go into the grass, and you think, well, what's they up to? Well, they're actually house hunting. They're having a look around and they're scoping out a few mice nests or voles nests holes in order to find out if that's somewhere where they can take over and make a nest for themselves. Okay, so wandering down through the reserve and onto the wet meadows now, there's actually very, very little in flower on the meadows at the moment, but some of the willows are in flower. You can just see all the flowers on the picture there. And this is what is providing the food for the hoverflies and bees. And actually, this is absolutely alive with them. So it's a real magnet. And wandering back through the reed beds, we spot something else. So I'm just going to play you a little video here. I don't know if you can see that. There are some common snipe there. And they seem to know that we want to look because they come to the front, go around, and then I like this video because they sort of come round again just so that you can have another little look. So we'll just give them another go. Come on, guys, don't let me down. Here they come. Okay, so these are wintering on the reserve. We don't actually have any breeding populations, but we do see them in winter, and it's very common to see them flying up from there. Okay, so we need to make choices about what we actually look at. And Helen's already talked a little bit about this. So one of the things we're looking at is bees and hoverflies. There are lots of different species of those, and they use all sorts of different parts of the habitat. So it's a great group to look at. As well as that, we look at butterflies, and like all the other species we look at really, because they're things that people know so much about, it means that we can actually get an idea of what they actually need and what we need to do on the reserve in terms of work. For example, this butterfly here down on the left is a large skipper. And we know that this one likes a rough grass called cocksfoot. Now, it's not something that you want all over the reserve, really. It's a very common grass, actually, that you often get in verges, things like that. And we don't want it everywhere, but we do want a little bit because the large skipper likes to lay its eggs on the leaves there. So that just gives you a tiny little view from the point of view of one animal that we find down there, of how finding them actually informs what we do on the reserve. Of course, we look at birds as well, and that's another group that is very well known, and it helps us really to choose the methods that we use to survey. And it also really helps us because a lot is known about them. It means that we can compare what we find out with what is known regionally and also nationally. We're also looking at mammals and amphibians. Unfortunately, that didn't happen on such a big scale this year because of COVID. We're looking at dragonflies, damselflies, and last but not least, the meadow plants themselves. And really, these are the basis of all the different variety of animals that live there and depend either directly or indirectly upon them. And of course, the plants in and of themselves are important as well. So just to take an example then, if you have a look at the map on the left and you see these sort of purple lines going through it, this is a route that I take every single month when looking at the dragonflies. And this follows the water on the reserve. So there are the ditches and there are also the ponds. It goes down through the reserve and then along the ditch as well. Now, of course, we can see dragonflies and damselflies, to be honest, all over the reserve, because what they're doing is they're hunting, they're looking for insects, and we can find them in the grassland. But a really well-tried way of looking for them is to follow the water, and you also get an idea of which species are actually breeding on the reserve. And if you have a look at the picture on the right-hand side, you can see all of these dots represents one of these different types of dragonfly or damselfly. And as you can see, they actually are present in most of the water on the reserve. Now, if you can see a red arrow has just appeared there, that actually is pointing to this spot here. And this is a day in May now. It is blazing hot. I'm sitting by this ditch having my lunch, having my sandwiches. Fantastic place to sit because it becomes very clear quickly that there is lots down there. The first thing I spot is broad-bodied chasers. These are dragonflies that come out early in the season. This one is actually sitting on a piece of grass. And if you can have a look at that picture, you can see that it has actually caught a fly and it's sitting there eating. As well as that, its near cousin really, the four-spotted chaser, is sitting on a piece of grass not very far away. But this one isn't eating. This one is actually dashing out from its perch every now and then, and it's chasing away other four-spotted chasers. It's really defending a territory there. As well as that, actually, I can see it being quite aggressive, and it really goes for some of the other dragonflies that appear as well. So it's quite a feisty animal, and it's not having intruders. Down near the water itself, there are absolutely loads of azure damselflies, and they're sort of bobbing very gently along. And as you can see, there's males and females together, it's mating behaviour, and the female will soon be laying eggs into the water. And then finally, I spot a large red damselfly. Now, these are actually really quite common damselflies, but at this stage in the season, I don't know that this is one of only two that I'm going to see across the whole season. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of footage of the one of the chasers laying eggs on the water. It's the broad-bodied chaser. There's the female, sort of golden colour, and just flying past now is the male, the large blue one. And what he's doing probably is guarding her because he doesn't want other males interfering while she's laying eggs which have been fertilized by him. Okay, so that's a little introduction to the dragonflies, but how do we actually decide that this is a good site for wildlife or not, something which has a lot of wildlife or just a little? Well, one thing we can do is to look at all the different species in a particular group, for example, in dragonflies, and see how many we have. And it's always nice also to see dragonflies which are not quite so common locally, even though generally nationally this one is, the black-tailed skimmer is not particularly uncommon, but it's a little bit fussier than others. And it has very specific needs, and it likes some bare earth, some bare soil or gravelly areas at the side of pools. And this pool on the main meadow where I'm standing there is some bare soil over here. And this is where I see the black-tailed skimmer across the season. Now, it's not the only way that we can measure if it's a valuable site though. And another thing we can do is measure it against the standards that people have for deciding whether these places become designated as an officially good place. And one measure of that is if it could become a local wildlife site. Now, as Helen already mentioned, part of the bottom of the reserve is already a local wildlife site, and that means it's been assessed. It's got a really good group of species there. It's a valuable habitat. It's good enough that we can actually have it on a register which says, yes, this is a special place for wildlife. The main meadow, however, doesn't fall into that category yet. but by looking at what we have there, particularly our group of dragonflies and also butterflies, we know that the reserve is actually moving in the right direction in order to inquire further and put in an application to make sure it gets this designation. Okay, so this is all the dragonflies and damselflies that we saw during 2020. As you can see, there are loads of these, not many of a lot of these, and it'd be tempting to think that these at the bottom, as your damselflies, are doing really well. Well, they are, but they're not necessarily doing better than the ones at the top here, where there's just 1 or 2 records. And the reason for that is that as your damselflies are small, they're not particularly fussy about others being around, they're not territorial, and they're very adaptable, they move in quickly. They're actually also quite sensitive to water pollution, so it's a good sign about the quality of the water on the site. On the other hand, going up to the other end of the graph, a lot of these, not all of them, but a lot of them are larger dragonflies, and these tend to need a lot more space. Some of them are very territorial, so they would defend quite a large area of the river or the ditches or the ponds, any of the water there. So you need to know a little bit about the species to tell a little bit more about that. Okay, so we're going to fast forward now and we're going to June. The meadow is looking really different. And I know you could be forgiven for thinking, looking at that it's all grasses. But actually, when you have a closer look, it is actually full of all sorts of wildflowers. And I don't know if you can see in just down on the right-hand side of this picture, there's a yellow flower there lurking in amongst the grasses. That could be a few things actually, but one of the things it could be is this flower on the right. And this is yellow rattle. It's a really fantastic flower to have on the reserve, particularly when you're starting a meadow, because this is something that actually uses its roots to tap into the roots of grasses. It takes away the water, it takes away the food that the grasses have, and it stops them growing. Now that is a really good thing, because if you have too many grasses, what happens is wildflowers can't grow so effectively. So this is basically what we call a hemiparasite, and it's helping us out with getting the meadow into really good condition. So it's a blazing hot day when me and Hilary Ash, who's one of the plant experts who was involved at the beginning, go down onto the reserve to look at the different plants. And on the left here, you have a sort of W shape of dots. And this simply marks all the spots where each year, more or less the same spots, we put down one of these squares, which we call quadrats, and we count the plants. We find out which plants are in that and how many times they appear in each of these squares. And we do that across the meadow, and we can use it to compare with the previous year's data. Now, this, like some of the other surveys, is one where we had actually asked a number of different volunteers to volunteer and come along and help us with the survey. And very unfortunately, because of what happened with COVID, etc., we weren't able to train our teams or use our teams. So that was really sad. Anyway, Hilary and I had a very long day on the reserve, but again, very enjoyable looking at the plants. And really what we were doing, you could say that this is really like measuring the health of the meadow. Is it in good health or is it looking a bit poorly? And in order to do that, we select about 8 plants that we call positive indicators. What that means is they're ones that are desirable, they're ones that give a really good indication, if they're growing in good numbers, that the meadow is moving towards a state which we want it to be in. So we've got black knapweed and oxeye daisy here. Those are 2 of the ones which are good. And then we also have negative indicators. Now, I shouldn't really use the word good and bad, because negative doesn't necessarily mean, you know, bad plants. We actually, you know, these are actually in some ways they're fine. The white clover on the side here, it's a really great nectar source for bees, for example. We just don't want it in very great numbers, because this plant is really excellent at enriching the soil and making it, you know, like a starter kit for really vigorous competitive grasses, and we don't want that to happen because we don't want those to take over again. So although it's okay to have it there, we need to keep an eye out and make sure it's not there in really high numbers. Now you might think I've just used this as an excuse to put a picture of a butterfly here. This is a small skipper, but this is the grass that we're meant to be looking at. And the reason that I've put butterfly on it as well is that although this is not a grass that we want all over the meadows in really great numbers, this is a grass that is used by these small skippers. They lay their eggs inside the stems there. And it's in order to have the skippers, we need the grass. They do use a few other grasses, but this is the main one on site, which is one of the ones they use usually. So not necessarily bad things, but just, keep an eye out. Don't let them get out of hand and take over. So here are the results from this year. So on the left-hand side of the graph is 2017, when we first started doing this, and then moving over to the right is this year. And you can see that the positive indicators went up and up and up, and then took a dip this year. Negative indicators went up, not at such a rate, and took a sharp dip this year as well. Now, that picture that you're looking at, actually, it's not a bad thing at all. We did the survey a little bit earlier than previous years. It was a very, very dry year. The plants were probably suffering from a bit of heat stress, and there weren't as many when we looked at it. But the really important thing is the balance between the positive and negative indicators. And this shows clearly that this year, the positive indicators are in a much stronger position still than the negative ones. So this was actually a great result. There are changes in the meadow really, across the season. I mean, this picture on the left is taken in spring, and on the right, this is taken in summer. However, these pictures were taken on different years. And to be honest, this one from a few years ago, with the sort of main colour theme of mainly white, that's mainly the oxeye daisies, it really shows the difference between that year and this year, where the colour themes were more yellow and purple, which was black knapweed and various things, but mainly bird's foot trefoil. And that's a kind of natural process that happens as meadows develop. And so we're looking also at what types of flowers are on there and what's doing well, because this is a natural process of change. And Hilary here is standing at the top of the meadow. There was part of the meadow where we didn't take away the topsoil, where different management was carried out. And as you can see, she's absolutely nearly waist deep in grasses there. It's mainly grass. You might be able to spot some dock as well. There are some flowers in there, but really very, very few. And really, I think this illustrates a clear difference between this and the result on the right 4 or 5 years later, where the meadow really is beginning to change its composition. And I've just thrown in the photo there as well of the 2016 shot to show you what a difference that those years can make. Now, we talked about those bunds or mounds at the side of the meadow. When the soil was scraped off the meadow, it was put into these mounds at the side. And these look really different. Some trees are planted on them, but also there are some plants growing on there, sort of thistles and docks and, tall grasses and nettles and things like that. And these are really strong growing plants that are not going to let many other wildflowers grow. They're very, very competitive. But it doesn't mean that we don't want some of that type of habitat on the reserve. And this little red circle here is showing you a small tortoiseshell, which we definitely do want. And actually, these were doing really well on the reserve this summer. This was a really good year for some other butterflies as well. And had you walked onto the meadow in June, for example, and for the rest of the summer, you might have seen all the time meadow brown butterflies flying up as you walked along, staying quite low to the ground, but flying up, landing a little way further on. These were very prevalent, and their numbers absolutely boomed this year. It's a common butterfly, but we still want space for the common stuff as well, because everything in the UK is not necessarily finding enough space for all of the wildlife. There were also really good numbers of white butterflies, including green-veined white, which was more prevalent down on the wet meadows at the bottom. They, the other white butterflies were down there as well, but the green-veined tend to really like the kind of damper areas. Some butterflies, on the other hand, weren't doing so well as previous years. One was the orange tip. This tends to appear a little bit earlier in the year. It does persist, but I really only recorded a few. And one of the possibilities really is that in the time that I wasn't on the reserve, because of the COVID restrictions, I missed most of their season when they were there. Now, it's really exciting when new stuff turns up on the reserve, and we had 3 butterflies and also 6 moths that turned up that hadn't been recorded on the reserve before. So that was really nice to see. And one of them was ringlet butterflies. They really all on one side of the reserve, just walking up through the tall grasses. They'd be flying up from the grass, looking a little bit like a meadow brown. Sometimes had to have a closer look, but sort of behaving a little bit different, and just in that one part of the reserve. But it was great to see them arriving, and also some moths. One of the new species that turned up of butterflies caused me a little bit of bother actually, and that was the Essex skipper. Now, this is the Essex skipper on the left. On the right, we have the small skipper, and as you can probably appreciate, they really are lookalikes. And when I knew that the Essex skipper might be turning up, so I was having a close look at all the small skippers just to make sure, and almost immediately I found an Essex skipper. And as you can probably see, the antennae tips, at the end there are really inky black, whereas with the small skipper, they're sort of more orangey or even browny and very nondescript sometimes, depending on the individual. And these butterflies are really quite tiny. I mean, one could fit on your thumbnail easily. They're really small. And I was reading, I was thinking, is there an easier way really to tell them apart? And I was reading about it, and one book was saying, yeah, it's really easy. What you do is you get down on all fours, you kind of crawl up to them, you look from underneath, and you can tell really easily. Let me assure you that this didn't go too well. And I really, there were a lot of these things. I wasn't going to do that with all of the small skippers. So I ended up having to net them and put them in pots, have a little look at them. And then I found that when I opened the pots, they just crawled out, posed for a photograph before flying off. Okay, now also when we're doing the monitoring, we also keep an eye out for things which we've been warned or we're aware that might be turning up again. Now, the white letter hairstreak is a butterfly that is in trouble in this country. It is spreading though, it is in Cheshire, and it has been recorded on the reserve a long time ago. And when I went down in spring, I noticed some leaf damage like that, and doing a little bit of research, I found out that that possibly was due to white letter hairstreaks. So we set up a bit of a survey, and this is Alina again, who came down with another of our volunteers, Sue, and they did some regular surveying there to look. And Alina is looking up into the top of the tree because white letter hairstreaks tend to hang around there. Unfortunately, we didn't see any this year, but here's keeping our fingers crossed for next year. Okay, so some of our new finds on the reserve were butterflies like this brimstone. However, as you can see here on the chart, there were a lot of new bees and wasps. This is partly because it's fairly new for us to be looking on a regular basis for these, and also there are a lot of species and they're not that easy to find. You can see at the end there's something called others, and that was because there are lots of different things here. There's moss, lichen, there's fungi, all sorts of things. And a lot of these records actually, including lots of the bird records, were down to people recording who, just go down, they want to do some recording for themselves, they want to spend some time in a nice place, and they then send the records onto records. So we're always really grateful for any records that people send us. And it's brilliant because it gives us more information and a fuller picture about the reserve. Now, this is a morning in spring. It's 5:30 in the morning. It's absolutely beautiful, very clear sky, it's sunny. I'm starting down on the reserve because I'm doing the bird survey. And when I walk onto the reserve, there is really such a lot of noise on the reserve, and that is from the birds all around. They're in full voice, and the most prominent are the wrens and the chiffchaffs, which really sound like they're absolutely shouting. And in some ways, you want to just tell them, please just be a little bit quieter so I can hear other things. But then as you begin to listen, you very quickly pick up a number of the other species that are here all year round, but also warblers that have flown in from other places. And there are a number of them around the reserve. Now, it turns out that that time in the morning is also quite a good time to look for other things. So whatever that was hunting, I really, really hope it got it, but we were very glad to catch that on camera. Okay, so Tony Parker, who's the chairman of the trustees at Records, came out to help on the bird surveys. And we spent our time looking, but also listening out for the birds. And on the right, this rather sort of busy sheet of paper that I was writing on while we were doing the survey, we were recording all of the different types of birds. We saw all the different species, but also whether they were singing or not. And if they were singing, it's a fairly good indication that they're establishing a territory, attracting a female and setting up a breeding territory. And it's a really good way of establishing really how many birds are actually using the reserve for breeding and nesting. Now, the route also took us along the edge of the canal. And I don't know if you remember, I was telling you that there's a reed bed which extends along the canal, which is part of the reserve. And really, you can only see into that from the towpath on the canal. So that's why we were down there. And walking along there one morning, again, very, very early, we were stopped in our tracks because underneath all the noise of the other birds around us, very close, but hiding in some bushes, was a lesser whitethroat and singing very clearly. Now, this happened enough weeks in a row to tell us that this was actually setting up a nesting, a breeding territory. And actually, one of the people who looks for birds regularly along there and sometimes sends us his records also took a photo of some lesser whitethroat chicks as well a little bit later in the season. Now, one of the reasons this was exciting was because although we know that they're down there, we've never actually recorded them frequently enough to be able to actually establish that they're using the reserve for breeding. So that was great. And there were a few other species that we also found that were nesting on the reserve. And it was the first year when we were able to establish that they too were doing so. One of them was green finches and another goldfinches. Now, in all, there were 19 species where we could actually see that there were breeding territories. And some of these, there were just a few territories, like the sedge warblers here. Walking along the canal, you'd hear them singing. They'd be flying up into the air, still singing, and then drop down again into the reeds. So very, very clear there. But on the other hand, there were a number of birds actually, and a growing number of birds who had over 10 territories within the reserve space. And one of these was the common whitethroat that you can see here. And these were very prominent, and we really got a feel for, as soon as you walked on the reserve, there's going to be one over there, there's going to be one over there, there's going to be one over there. It was very clear where their territories were. But of course, we didn't just see 19 species of birds, we saw 53 on those 9 survey days. And of those, 31 of them we saw a lot of different times. However, there were some others which were probably, to be honest, breeding on the reserve, but we didn't see very often. And that could have been just because they're a little bit harder to spot. And one of them, like this on the left, a bullfinch, is quite a shy bird. It tends to skulk in kind of trees and bushes a little bit more. And also it's got a very soft voice, so it can be a little bit harder to detect. As well as that, some of the ones we only saw maybe once or twice, they could have been birds that were just flying over, dropping by, using the reserve for resting or maybe for feeding, like this wheatear. But even if they're just doing that, the reserve still has value for them because they're finding somewhere that they can use when they're en route to other places. Also, we were pleased to see that 35 of the species we recorded are birds of conservation concern. That means that they have been assessed as being in trouble, basically, in the country. And if they are classed as amber, it means that they're in moderate amount of trouble, and red, they're in severe trouble. And the way that this assessment is made is whether their population numbers have gone down a lot or whether their range has really contracted a lot as well. And a few of these were also some of our breeding birds. So we have the dunnock and the reed bunting and the mallard, and also song thrushes. Now you might be surprised to see a very common bird like the mallard in here, but this has been assessed, even though you think of this as something that you see every time you go down to local pond or whatever, they are actually, their numbers are dropping, their range is contracting. And so they are something which there is some concern about. It's not just birds though, where we were finding animals which are a little bit rarer. And in June, it was very exciting to come across this bee. I was just walking by one of the log mounds in the reserve, and I saw this little bee. It was absolutely tiny and just flitting about, and I had to look at it and I thought, yeah, I know what this is, so I'll just, leave that alone. And then I had another look and I thought, no, there's something different, and it's got these very dark wings as well. I thought, well, I better have a bit of a closer look at that, and I'm really glad I did, because this turned out to be something which I think is a little bit unkindly called the plain dark bee. But this was really special because if you look at the map on the left-hand side, these are all the places in the country where it has been found, and the black dots are where it has been found since the year 2000. So it really is very rare. It is rated as nationally scarce. And another reason that this was really great to find was that this is the reserve, this star here. This is actually the furthest north that this bee has been recorded in this country. And also it's the first time that it's been recorded in Cheshire. Now this is the log mound in question that I was talking about. And to be honest, once you've stood there for a couple of minutes, you start to appreciate that this actually isn't a log mound. This is actually really a city. There is so much going on there. And I'm just going to introduce you to some of the things using it. First up, we have jewel wasps. Now this is another very tiny little creature, but it might catch your eye because it has this really metallic sort of pink and turquoise on it. It's a beautiful little thing, and it was flitting around the logs there. Another one, something completely different, and that is something which is also a wasp. And you can see that it's got a very long body, but also coming out of the back of its body, it's got what looks like a very, very long sting. Now, this isn't a sting, this is actually an egg-laying tube. And just a moment later, after I saw this, it moved forward, it went to this hole where there was probably another bee nesting, and it sort of unsheathed this egg-laying tube and put it down there, and it was laying eggs inside there. Okay, and then the last one I want to introduce you to is this. It's another wasp, but this one is different. If you see, it's got these really powerful, long and strong legs, and it was scurrying really fast, every now and then taking off, but really preferring to run rather than to fly. And the reason for that is that this is a spider hunting wasp, and these things really, it is perfect for them in the grassland because the grassland is absolutely full of spiders, so it's good hunting territory. Now, of the 32 species of bees and wasps which I found over the season on the reserve, actually nearly a third of them have been recorded less than 10 times in Cheshire. And it's just to put that into perspective, it's actually not that uncommon to find bees and wasps which haven't been recorded very often, partly just because they are so small, they can be difficult to find, and also there probably aren't that many people who are looking for them. This beautiful little bee here has actually only been recorded 8 times in Cheshire before. Okay, on the other end of the spectrum though is the bumblebees, and my goodness, I found a lot of these. I found absolutely hundreds of both of these two. These were sort of, you know, real top of the recording charts really. This is a common carder bumblebee and this is a red-tailed bumblebee, and they were everywhere. They were loving all the flowers on the reserve. And it really underlined for me, I mean, for a start, they're probably nesting on the reserve, and one of the real benefits that the reserve has for them is that there are a lot of flowers in one place. Now, these are strong bees. They're perfectly capable of flying quite a distance to find flowers if they absolutely have to. However, because we have a lot of flowers in one place, the real advantage is it means that they have a much better chance of the nest actually producing young that are going to survive until the following year. So bumblebees often, they don't have a very good rate of success with survival, but if you have a nice place which has loads of flowers in one place, they really stand a better chance. Also the hoverflies. Now some of those were very common species, like this one top left, and I've put them in smaller photos because I saw them less and less frequently, and this one only a couple of times. And these were, a lot of them I found actually on flowers on the reserve. And I don't know if you're aware, but hoverflies are the real unsung heroes of pollination. So they're going onto flowers, they're walking around, moving pollen from one flower to another, and they're helping the flowers, also the plants, with survival. So they're really important. And in this country, also, they're important from the commercial and crop point of view as well. We often think of bees or honeybees doing that job, but actually having the variety is absolutely essential so that you're not really putting all your eggs in one basket and relying too heavily on one species. And it tended to be that in the wet areas of the reserve, so the wetlands, and in the drier areas, in the grasslands, I was finding different species of hoverflies. Now, one of the reasons for this, and I can speak generally, but it's not, you know, it's not completely hold true, but speaking generally, is that although all the adults feed on nectar and pollen, the young, which look like maggots, really, so you know, although they've got a bit of a bad image there, they are actually doing this really vital job, and they are very keen on rotting vegetation. So a lot of the ones in the wetlands tend to like that, or aphids. And you find ones in both habitats, but particularly in the grasslands, which are eating aphids. And this is really performing a service for us, because if aphids get present in too big numbers, they can actually end up being a problem, particularly in places with crops. And so there, you know, I'm sure if you're a gardener, you know that you don't want too many aphids. Well, just get hoverflies into your gardens, because those are the things that are going to do the work for you in getting rid of them. It's September now. It's getting a little bit later in the season. There's a real different feel on the reserve as you walk around. A lot of the bushes and the trees have lots of fruits and berries on them. Also, a lot of the flowers have really beautiful seed heads, like this one on the bird's foot trefoil, which is partly where it gets its name from, bird's foot apparently. And I'm very, very excited to come across this. I'm sure a lot of you recognize what this actually is. Actually, I didn't find it, somebody else found it and pointed it out to me, but I was really excited, and then I was very happy to show all sorts of other people, and you know, they were just happy to assume that it was me who had found it in the first place, which was just fine. And these things are really huge. It is the caterpillar of the elephant hawk moth, and these were really appreciating one of their main food plants as caterpillars, which is the willow herbs. And these willow herbs were growing on those bunds or mounds at the side of the reserve. So that's also allowing a little bit of connection between some wildlife, which we want on the reserve, and some of the plants in the different places on the reserve. But a couple of days later, I was even more excited to come across this. And I'm really disappointed in this photo because actually this, when I came across this, it looked huge. You know, it looked like something that you could trip over. Okay, probably only a couple of inches long, to be honest. But even so, for a wasp, it was really big, really noticeable, and it stopped me in my tracks. And after doing a bit of research and consulting with the experts in the country who know how to identify these types of wasps, which is a very big group, they were able to tell me what it was and that this is the only animal which actually lays eggs inside the caterpillar of the elephant hawk moth. And then that egg, it hatches and the young eats the caterpillar from the inside out. So it's a little bit of a gruesome story, but it's another real connection in the kind of web of connections of all the things living down there. So it was nice to find that. And incidentally, just to let you know that also for this particular wasp, having done a little bit of research and looked around, I could only find 15 records in the whole country of this animal. Now, I'm assured by the experts that this is actually probably quite a common animal. It's just that there are so few people in the country which are looking at these and know how to record them, that it's not very well recorded, but it's probable that everywhere where you get these particular caterpillars, you also get these wasps. But nevertheless, it's really nice to have a positive record there. Now, as well as me finding things on the reserve, some things really found me, and that was just fine by me. One of the things that we recorded for the first time this year was this, and it's a longhorn beetle. The name longhorn comes from these very long antennae that you can see there. And it's a particular type called a four-barred longhorn beetle. It's not an unusual species, but there aren't that many records in Cheshire. And to be honest, it's the first time it's been recorded on the reserve. And I just remember I saw it flying towards me. It looked really big, and then it landed on my shirt, and I just thought, oh, okay, perfect. So I was just able to get my phone out and take a picture before it flew off again. Another longhorn beetle, which landed on my clipboard, and a few things were attracted by the light colour of the clipboard. Now, I can't really finish without talking about another species which was very abundant on the reserve this year. And as soon as the sun came out, really, more and more people started making it down onto the reserve. Now, I know these particular people here. They're two of the volunteers from Record. They were visiting me to have a little walk around and also to have lunch together on the reserve one day. But there were lots of people using the reserve. And as I got talking to people, I became aware that the reserve had become a bit of a popular sort of place to go during lockdown for your lockdown exercise. And a lot of people said they were coming there every week or even every day, to be honest, and really beginning to appreciate the space. And it was just nice to see people kind of walking or meeting friends, relaxing, having picnics, the kids playing on the reserve, you know, just using the space. And it is a nice place, actually. It's just a nice place to be. And a lot of people say we're just really enjoying finding out a little bit more about some of the things that I've shown you and the other things that they spotted on the reserve. And I particularly remember one conversation with a 10-year-old budding fly expert who was showing me all the hoverflies that he had found, which was great. Now, any time of season, to be honest, you are going to see stuff on the reserve. And even if you went down there tomorrow, these are some of the things which you could potentially see. It takes a little bit of patience, sometimes a little bit of time, but it is a space which obviously I'm a little bit biased, but it's really worth going down and discovering and enjoying that space there. So I'm going to finish up there, but as I finish, I just want to say thank you to various people, because when you do monitoring of that sort, actually a lot of people in the background are supporting and helping with that effort. Now, it would be, like I mentioned before, it'd be really lovely at this point to be saying thank you to all the people who volunteered to help us with the surveys. I'm sorry I can't this year say that thank you and that you weren't able to come down and do that with me. But it was really nice that people did volunteer. But also there were a number of people like the volunteers at Record who did a lot of data input and survey support. And these are some of the people I really hope I haven't forgotten anybody there. So I'm really grateful to them. Also county recorders who helped me out with verification of identifications and also information, assistance with surveys from a few people, as I mentioned, and also some people very kindly who go to the reserve often let us use some of their photos as well. And others were great and gave me information that I was able to use. So at this point, I'm just going to say, if you have any questions, we would be very happy to take your questions. Alina is going to really field those questions and direct them. And while you're thinking about if you have any questions, I'm going to let you look at the last slide, which really is a picture of everything that is that we found on the reserve during the year. So that was sort of putting into groups all the species and what proportions we found them in. And at the bottom here on the right, you can just see a little chart which gives a comparison compared to the previous years as well. So it's been really nice to be able to, share a little bit about the reserve, and we'd be very happy to answer any questions. Thank you.